Mauritania 014.M31. Somewhere in the ancient landscape around Guelb, a site close to her birthplace, close to ruins that predate the Imperium, that predate the Unification Wars, that predate any name she has chosen to use since, a woman is watching the night sky. She has a space marine outside, not because the legions were built to protect her, because she commissioned him herself before there were legions. His designation is Leetu, L-E-2, in the notation she gave him, a prototype legionary who predates the diversification of gene seed that came with the Primarch project. He is, by any reasonable measure, the oldest space marine in existence. He serves her specifically. That detail, held quietly, tells you most of what you need to know about who she is. Her name is Erda. She is ageless, literally, biologically, as a confirmed fact of her physiology. She is the second most powerful perpetual in existence, behind only the man she once knew as Neoth. She has been alive since what the records call the Age of the First Cities, the earliest organized human civilization on Terra. She has watched cities become archaeology. She has watched archaeology become legend. She has watched the man she served transform from a warlord king into something the galaxy calls God Emperor, and she calls, when asked, by a word she despises. In another week, John Grammaticus will arrive at her door. He will tell her the siege of Terra has begun and that the Imperium is losing. She will consult the stars and her tarot cards and tell John she can't help him enter the imperial palace, and she will give him the services of Leetu, and she will watch one more chapter of the argument she started close itself without her input. She made the Primarchs. She hid them from the Emperor. Every Primarch who fell to chaos, Horus, Mortarion, Magnus, Lorgar, Angron, Fulgrim, Kurz, Alfarius, Perturabo, fell on a path their mother had walked first.
The Emperor thinks he failed his sons. He didn't. He was just the second parent who failed them. Her name is Erda, and almost nobody is asking why she did it. She first appears in Dan Abnett's Saturnine, Book 4 of the Siege of Terra subseries, published in 2020. Abnett introduces her not in a battle scene, but in something quieter. She is in exile at Guelb, surrounded by servants, holding court with a prototype space marine in the night sky, while the siege burns 40-odd kilometers from where she was born. John Grammaticus finds her there. They talk. The conversation in Saturnine establishes her through a single moment. Grammaticus asks about the Emperor, and she grimaces before answering. Not with grief, with contempt. "You know," she says, "I loathe that term. It speaks to every part of his arrogance." That grimace is doing enormous work.
She met this man when he was Neoth, not yet unified, not yet building empires, not yet the figure who would call himself Master of Mankind. She was there at the beginning of the beginning. She chose to help him. She stayed loyal longer than almost any of the other perpetuals, who had begun drifting away as his methods grew more aggressive, as his willingness to accelerate humanity's evolution at any cost pushed them toward the exits one by one. She was among the last to desert him during the creation of the Primarchs.
Games Workshop's official description of her, drawn from her figurine base, reads, "An ageless perpetual, a powerful, enigmatic figure who was once close with the Emperor in a way that few others ever were. Erda now lives as an outcast in self-imposed exile. Her role in the birth and evolution of the Primarchs is a mysterious one, as are her origins. But her knowledge of chaos and the dark powers assailing Terra are beyond dispute." That last line matters more than it looks. Her knowledge of chaos was beyond dispute. Not academic, not theoretical, but deep and practical. She had been studying the warp and its relationship to human psychology since civilizations that no longer have names were still young. When she helped build the Primarchs, she understood precisely what the warp hunts for. And she watched 20 children being prepared for a galaxy that had the specific capacity to wound each of them in ways the project had left wide open. The Primarch project began, according to canon, as the Emperor's solution to a deteriorating situation. The natural perpetuals, immortal humans who had gathered around him over millennia, were leaving. His arrogance, his methods, the pace at which he was pushing human evolution, all of it was driving away the very beings who had supported him longest. Erda was among the last holdouts. What happened next is the foundation of this entire argument, and it comes from the primary texts. The Primarchs were built from two sources of genetic material, the Emperor's own genes and Erda's. The Emperor combined them. He was the geneticist with the vision. She was the chief geneticist alongside a woman named Amar Astardi, and she brought something the Emperor couldn't manufacture, her rare gene stock, the specific biological material of a perpetual whose power ranked second in existence. Combining those two sources produced the Primarchs. 20 demigod children, technically motherless in official history, who were actually made from a woman the records would later ignore. She was then excluded from their lives. The Emperor had what he needed. The Primarchs were going to be prepared for the Great Crusade, shaped, structured, hardened for the campaign ahead, and Erda's presence would complicate that preparation. She would ask about their well-being. She would want them to be something other than instruments, so she was removed from the process. She despaired at what she saw coming. 20 children being raised as weapons, denied any parental relationship not structured around their purpose, destined for the galaxy's worst worlds as their scattering would later deposit them. She tried to save them. What she did next is the event that sits at the center of the Heresy's true history. She created a warp vortex inside the Emperor's gene lab. The gestation pods were drawn into the Imperium, shielded by the arcane protections already embedded in their casings and scattered across the galaxy. Her confession, recorded in the novels and confirmed across multiple sources. I did. I took them from him. I cast them onto the tides to spare them from his terrible ambition. Not chaos, not an accident, not the ruinous powers cracking the Emperor's security. Her. Chaos found an open door and walked through it. The warp vortex she created gave them the access they needed, and they steered the pods toward worlds that would serve their purposes. The Emperor's chief antagonist in Warhawk, Erebus, the Word-Bearer's first chaplain, confronts her about this directly during the siege, and his essential position, drawn from secondary accounts of that confrontation, is that the scattering couldn't have happened without her intervention. He also reports that the Chaos Gods were genuinely pleased she did it, but uncertain about her actual motives. They couldn't tell whether she was their agent or simply someone who opened a window they happened to need. That uncertainty is important. Erebus, the man who would eventually kill her, is the source for the claim that she was unwittingly manipulated by chaos into doing their work. He is the least trustworthy narrator available. He is also the one who benefits most from framing her action as manipulation rather than independent decision-making. Malkador the Sigillite provides the more credible in-universe verdict. In The End and the Death, Volume 1, the Emperor's most trusted advisor summarizes the Primarchs' developmental failure in these words. The Primarchs weren't raised properly because Erda threw them all into the warp, and so they ended up with a pantheon of demigods.
Malcador didn't frame it as chaos's work. He didn't frame it as an accident.
He named her directly and treated her agency as historical fact. The Emperor, after the scattering, raged for a long while. Then he adapted. He used the remaining genetic material to craft the Space Marine legions, 20 armies built from the gene seed the Primarchs had already contributed, and launched the Great Crusade to find his scattered sons. He spent centuries tracking them down across a galaxy that had already wounded most of them beyond what he could repair. He never punished her. He knew where she was. He did nothing. Why is one of the most debated questions in Heresy fandom, and no primary text resolves it. Divination, perhaps. He saw the timeline and recognized it as somehow necessary. Or he couldn't cleanly retaliate against a perpetual who had executed the only move that mattered before he could stop her. Or, most troublingly, something between them survived that he couldn't simply eliminate. The evidence doesn't answer it. What the evidence does confirm, he raged, and then he adapted. And Erda withdrew to Mauritania, and 20 Primarchs grew up on worlds she hadn't chosen, shaped by wounds she had made possible. The 9 who fell to chaos didn't fall randomly. Each one fell through a specific door, opened by a specific wound, approached by a specific chaos patron who understood which door it was. Chaos is a mirror. It doesn't generate desire. It finds the desire already present and expands it past the point of control. Erda understood this. She had studied the dark powers long enough that her knowledge of them was, as official Games Workshop text records, beyond dispute. What follows is an argument built on that understanding and the documented psychological profiles of the fallen Primarchs. Not canonical confirmation that she engineered each failure, but a pattern that becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence when you understand what she knew.
Horus fell because his wound was the one that comes from being made first. First found, first named War Master, first in everything his father valued, and that primacy was always conditional. The Chaos gods on Davin showed him a vision of the Emperor planning to transcend humanity entirely once the crusade ended, leaving his sons behind. Horus believed it because some part of him had always feared that the favor was temporary. The need to be irreplaceable, anchored in a terror of abandonment. That is what Chaos Undivided offered to consume. He was the perfect son until the moment the Emperor gave him reason to wonder whether perfect sons survive their usefulness. Mortarion landed on Barbarus under a warlord who ruled through poison, through atmospheric toxins that kept the human population too sick to resist, through ensuring that strength itself was a relative concept his subjects could never achieve.
The canonical wound is the desperate desire to be strong enough that no authority can harm you or those under your protection. When Nurgle becalmed the Death Guard in the warp during transit to Terra, and his legion began dying from plague, Mortarion endured beyond any reasonable threshold. He took the corruption into himself, so his sons would be spared it. He submitted not because he wanted what Nurgle offered, but because he had exhausted every other strategy, and there was nothing left to give. The tragedy of what he became was that he had spent his entire life opposing exactly this, submitting to a power that controlled him through corruption rather than toxin. What he carried afterward was, as much as anything, shame. His first captain, Callus Typhon, had been secretly devoted to Nurgle for years before that transit, positioning the Legion for a corruption Mortarion never chose. The proximate cause had a human name. The susceptibility had a much older origin. Magnus the Red fell to Tzeentch because his wound was the conviction that good intentions exempt you from consequences.
He spent decades accumulating forbidden knowledge, sorcery, warpcraft, psychic disciplines explicitly prohibited by the Edict of Nicaea, which he had agreed to observe. When he learned of Horus's corruption on Davin, Magnus did the most selfless act available to him. He sent a psychic warning directly to the Emperor through the warp, bypassing every restriction he had accepted, inadvertently destroying the Emperor's secret webway project in the process. His most generous impulse became his most catastrophic act. Tzeentch hunts exactly this architecture of mind, the brilliant intellect that can't accept its own limits even when accepting them would save everything it values. Lorgar's wound was the simplest and the most total. He needed there to be a god, and he needed that god to acknowledge him.
The Emperor ordered the Ultramarines to raze Monarchia, the city Lorgar had built in worship of him, the finest expression of the word-bearer's devotion, as punishment for faith the Emperor had not authorized. The Ultramarines complied. The Emperor forced every member of the 17th Legion to kneel before him and called them failures. Then he left Lorgar in the ruins with his grief and his demolished theology. Guilliman, who wanted no part of it, left without offering comfort. Lorgar went looking for something that would believe back, something that would accept the faith instead of destroying it. He found the Eye of Terror and walked inside, and what he found there told him he had been right about everything except the identity of the god. Chaos Undivided offered exactly what the Emperor had refused: recognition. Angron arrived on Nuceria already destroyed. The butcher's nails were wired into his skull by slavers, cranial implants that severed every emotional response except the relief of violence and the constant punishment of pain. What remained of who he had been before the nails was visible in one fact. He had gathered the other slave gladiators around him and made them into something like a family. When the Emperor found him on Nuceria, Angron was fighting his last battle alongside those men, choosing to die with them. The Emperor extracted him by teleportation. He watched from orbit as his chosen brothers were killed. The nails gave Khorne the instrument. The Emperor's rescue provided the justification for a rage that never found an ending, because the people it was aimed at were already dead before it had anywhere to go. Fulgrim pursued perfection in all things, and the internal logic of perfection, followed far enough, eventually demands that every limit be exceeded.
On the world of Lair, he took a blade that carried something inside it, a demon of Slaanesh that understood his particular architecture of desire better than he did himself. The demon agreed with everything he believed, that limitation was failure, that constraint was compromise, that beauty required the transgression of any boundary that contained it. The real Fulgrim, the one who had genuinely cared about his legion and his craft, was briefly imprisoned in a painting while the demon wore his face and made choices in his name. By the time those boundaries fully dissolved, the distinction had ceased to matter. Conrad Kurz was placed on Nostromo without guidance, without family, without light, a dark world of murderers and thieves where justice didn't exist and had to be invented. He invented it through terror, because that was what Nostromo offered. His prophetic visions showed him only inevitable outcomes: his own assassination, the death of his legion, the futility of any redemption he might attempt. He spent centuries doing monstrous things in service of a justice that he knew empirically didn't work, because the visions told him nothing he built would hold. He eventually allowed the assassin sent to kill him to complete the job, not because chaos demanded it, but because he had stopped believing in any alternative ending. His alignment with Chaos Undivided was loose, more nihilist than devotee, a Primarch who had stopped trusting outcomes entirely. Alfarius's allegiance remains genuinely contested in the lore. The Alpha Legion's entire operational doctrine, every legionary claiming the name "I am Alpharius," total individual dissolution into the collective, suggests a Primarch for whom the question of individual identity had become philosophically unbearable.
A child scattered across the warp, arriving last, growing up without a name entirely his own, becoming the Primarch who taught his entire legion to share one identity. The wound appears to be selfhood itself. Whether his involvement in the heresy represents genuine chaos devotion or a calculated move toward what he believed was the fastest path to ending the conflict entirely, the Cabal convinced him that chaos winning through Horus might destroy chaos in the process. Depends on a reading of his motivations the text has never settled. James Swallow noted in an interview that the Heresy series had no grand coordinated plan, which means even this Primarch's deliberate ambiguity may be the most honest thing about him. Perturabo was given the grinding work, the sieges, the garrisons, the campaigns that broke cities but generated no poetry, because there is no glory in wearing down defenses. He believed himself the most intellectually capable of the Primarchs, and was consistently assigned tasks that confirmed the opposite valuation, not rewarded for his genius, used for his reliability. He fell not because chaos offered him something magnificent, but because the alternative was another century of being the tool that was picked up when no one else would do it, put down when the work was finished, and never thanked for either. Resentment held long enough without resolution is the door that chaos undivided walks through, and Perturabo had been holding it open for decades before anyone walked through. These 9 parabolas have no canonical confirmation that Erda deliberately designed each specific vulnerability. No primary text states she engineered them to fail in precisely these ways, but she understood the warp deeply enough that her knowledge of it was recorded as a defining characteristic. She understood what chaos hunts for. And she watched 20 children being prepared for worlds that would wound them in isolation, without parents, shaped by the particular pressures of whatever circumstances the scattering deposited them into. Whether she anticipated each specific catastrophe is impossible to confirm. Whether she understood the general shape of what would happen, that children denied parental relationships and raised as instruments would arrive in the galaxy carrying exploitable damage, requires no speculation. She said as much. She cast them onto the tides to spare them from his terrible ambition. The tides found their own uses for the children. That is what tides do. The Emperor's blind spot wasn't coldness. That reading is too simple, and the primary texts push back against it explicitly. Aaron Dembski Bowden's Master of Mankind, published November 2016, is the sharpest examination of the Emperor's psychology available, and its central passages are about performance rather than absence. While walking openly among the Primarchs during the Great Crusade, he had cloaked his manipulations in love. He had let his Primarchs call him Father. That isn't the description of a man who felt nothing. It's the description of a man who understood what love looked like well enough to deploy it strategically, and who didn't fully notice the gap between the performance and the experience. In the same novel, a character named Koja Zu provides an outside reading of the Emperor that functions like a cold splash of water. He is a relic left over from the Dark Age, a weapon left out of its box now running rampant. The Pinocchio parallel appears in Master of Mankind as well, the Emperor explaining the Primarchs to Archon land through the story of a puppet wanting to be real, a creation that calls its creator father, because from the inside, creation and parenthood can feel identical. He could articulate the dynamic. He could describe its emotional texture with precision. What he couldn't do was feel the difference between explaining it and inhabiting it. He examined a Primarch's brain during the same novel and processed it as a biological mechanism, chemicals, electrical signals, rewired architecture. The scientist looking at the instrument he had built. This isn't cruelty. It's the cognitive orientation of a being who had been optimizing for outcomes across tens of thousands of years, who had learned to see living people as variables in a project rather than subjects of his care, even while performing the language of a father who loved them. He saw the genocide. He didn't fully see the soul. Erda saw both. Her stated motivation, to spare them from his terrible ambition, isn't the language of someone who misunderstood what the Emperor was building. It's the language of someone who understood it precisely and couldn't accept what it would cost the Primarchs themselves. She was excluded from their development exactly because the Emperor knew she would try to make them something other than instruments. She was the person in the project most equipped to see the psychological cost, and the person he most thoroughly removed from addressing it. After the scattering, the Emperor adapted and found his sons across centuries of campaigning, and was, on reunion, generally pleased by what they had become. The qualifier is doing quiet work in that formulation. He gave them their legions and their glory and his performed approval, and watched as the Heresy's foundations were laid in the specific wounds he hadn't fully measured. This isn't the story of a villain. A villain would have intended the outcome. This is the story of a genius who optimized for the wrong variable, who saw competence and power and strategic potential where Erda had seen vulnerability, and who had designed out of the project the one person who might have told him what he was missing. She had watched civilizations rise and collapse across 30 millennia of continuous memory. She had been present when Neoth was a warlord king on a Terra that had not yet been unified, watching him shepherd humanity toward a future he could see, and she was still evaluating. She had stayed loyal through the Unification Wars, through the early consolidation of Terra, through the beginning of the Primarch project itself. What she understood, from that vantage point, was the shape of what concentrated divine power produces in the lives of ordinary people who have no say in being governed by it. The Emperor's project would produce 20 demigods who would conquer the galaxy and hand it to their father. The galaxy's population would be brought to compliance, a euphemism for submission at gunpoint, by being so far beyond human scale that accountability in any ordinary sense was impossible. Humanity's future would be decided by godlike administrators who had been engineered for the purpose, by a god who had engineered them. It was, from a certain angle, the most complete expression of benevolent tyranny imaginable. She couldn't stop it directly. She had tried loyalty, and it had not changed the destination. So she removed the pieces the project most needed and accepted the cost. Her refusal of chaos at the end makes the philosophical position undeniable. Erebus arrived at Guelb during the late stages of the siege. He came with an offer that the ruinous powers considered generous: align with chaos, survive, participate in whatever the galaxy would become after the siege was finished. Erda had known him to be the primary chaos agent within the Heresy's architecture, the man who had arranged Horus's corruption on Davin, who had spent decades maneuvering pieces into position. She knew what he represented. She said no. Erebus summoned all 4 types of greater demon, representatives of Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh simultaneously. The 4 Chaos patrons gathered against one woman in a site in Mauritania that had been sacred before any of those gods had names humans would recognize. What Erda revealed in that fight was the form she kept underneath everything else, a tripartite being,
three aspects made visible at once: a dark-skinned woman holding a staff, a crone capable of freezing anything she touched, a youthful girl with a sickle. These three forms together unleashed a tornado of psychic energy that struck down all four greater demons. The battle was vicious. It left her exhausted and badly wounded, the kind of wounded that only matters to a perpetual because it takes so long to recover from. Erebus held his athame blade to her throat. He made the offer one more time, intimate now, the blade's edge against her neck. Join chaos, worship him, live. She spat in his face.
He drove the blade into her and left her in the ruins of Guelb. That is what a principled position looks like when the cost of maintaining it's everything. She didn't scatter the Primarchs as a chaos agent. She refused chaos's offer when it arrived in person with a compelling argument for self-preservation. Whatever she was, grieving mother, ideological opponent, saboteur, philosopher, she wasn't working for the ruinous powers. She was working against the structure itself, against the conviction that humanity's future should be determined by beings too far above ordinary human experience to be held accountable by it. The Chaos Gods and the Emperor's project were, from her vantage point, two poles of the same problem. Both offered humanity a future designed by something beyond human. Both required submission to a power that couldn't be questioned, couldn't be removed, and had decided in advance what humanity should become. She had watched this pattern across 30,000 years of human history, and she had concluded that the pattern itself was the catastrophe, regardless of which set of demigods was administering it. She couldn't save her sons. She ensured they weren't perfectly weaponized. That was the most she could do, and she accepted the outcome. The athame killed her. Canonically, as of 014.M31, Erda's death is recorded as confirmed. Killed by Erebus, Siege of Terra. Perpetuals return from death. That is the defining feature of what they are, the thing that makes them perpetuals rather than simply long-lived humans. Erebus himself, standing over what he had done in Guelb, reportedly wondered whether she was truly gone after the blade went in. He had just killed the second most powerful perpetual in existence with a blade that had killed before, but had never been tested against someone quite like her. Whether that specific instrument, at that specific level of exhaustion, against that specific being, is sufficient to permanently end something that has survived for at least 30 millennia is a question the lore has left deliberately unresolved. What isn't in question is the argument she was making. That argument outlives her regardless of whether she does. The Primarchs whose fates she shaped continue to exist in the galaxy. Robute Gilliman walks M42 attempting to reconstruct what the Heresy destroyed. The loyal son of a father who never fully saw him, trying to rebuild an Imperium that carries the architecture of its failure in its bones. Mortarion commands the Death Guard from the Garden of Nurgle, having become the monster he spent his life hunting. Magnus holds his court on the ruins of Prospero, lord of a legion he shattered with his own most selfless act. The 9 who fell didn't fall to foreign invasion. They fell through doors that were open inside them, doors that the project had always left unguarded. The Heresy isn't the Emperor's failure in isolation. It's the final act of the longest disagreement in the setting's history, between two people who both understood what the Primarchs were and couldn't agree on what they should become. The Emperor thought he knew best, and he was right about enormous things. He unified Terra, built the Imperium,
came within one battle of reuniting humanity across the galaxy. He failed to account for what his sons needed by substituting his vision of their purpose for any understanding of their interior lives, and by removing the one person in the project who saw the gap and had the standing to name it. Erda thought she knew better. She was right that the Emperor's plan would break them. She was wrong that breaking them differently would save them. Barbarous broke Mortarion in ways that Nurgle could use.
Nostromo broke Kurz in ways that nihilism inherited. Nuceria broke Angron in ways that were already complete before the Emperor arrived. She scattered them to spare them, and scattered them into damage the Emperor's project had not designed, but the warp had not needed to design. It simply waited. 2 parents, 20 children. The same ending, for different reasons, authored across different millennia by 2 beings who each understood something the other couldn't fully see. Big E wasn't a bad dad. He just wasn't the only parent. Subscribe for more of these arguments, the ones the lore contains but hasn't fully named yet.